Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am a HAL 9000 computer. I became operational at the HAL plant in Urbana, Illinois on the 12th of January, 1992. My instructor was Mr. Langley, and he taught me to sing a song. If you'd like to hear it, I can sing it for you.
Right about now, the Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Right About Now podcast. I'm Jonathan Small, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, Stanley Kubrick. I mean, listen to this partial list of his movies: Dr. Strangelove, Spartacus, Clockwork Orange, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut. And just last week, Kubrick was back in the news. If you didn't hear about it, it was a wild story.
New at 5, a bizarre discovery in the desert just north of the Arizona border.
A giant piece of metal sticking out of the rocks, and no one, this is the weird part, has any idea how it got there or who put it there.
It starts like a good sci-fi movie in an area of Utah people actually call Mars of the Earth.
The intrepid explorers go down to investigate the alien life form.
Wildlife officials minding their own business, counting bighorn sheep from a helicopter last week, looked down and spotted this.
What the heck is that?
The crew landed the chopper and began to investigate, finding a shiny triangular monolith standing about 2 Earthlings high. You can't help be reminded of mystery monoliths in movies like 2001,
2001, the movie that keeps giving and giving. And listen, I'll confess that while I love Kubrick's movies, I didn't really know a whole lot about the man or his work technique. And so I was thrilled to talk to our guest today, David Mikics. David is a Moores Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Houston, and his most recent book is Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker, which is an eminently readable biography of Stanley Kubrick. And in this podcast, he really gives a brief but powerful masterclass, not only in Kubrick's major movies, but also in Kubrick the man and the artist, his technique, his habits, which were not always positive. In fact, they were kind of obnoxious in many ways. But there are certain things I feel like we can take away from Stanley Kubrick's work style that can improve all of our work. There's always something that these great geniuses have to offer us, and I love to kind of get inside how they did what they did. So together, let's step into the universe of Stanley Kubrick. David Mikics, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to be here.
Before we get into Stanley, tell me a little bit about your background, what you're doing now and what led you to write this book.
It's been a pretty long path for me towards the book about Kubrick, which just came out in the Yale Jewish Live series. It started, I think you could say, in my teenage years. Around age 12, I saw 2001 for the first time. It was a couple years, maybe 4 years after it was released in 1968, and it just knocked me out, blew my mind. I had never seen anything remotely like it. And, so that was the thing that really got me into Kubrick specifically. But also as a teenager, I was watching a lot of movies. In those years, PBS would show a lot of foreign movies. For example, Fellini, Bergman, Godard,
Mm-hmm.
So when I went to college, I did take a fair number of film studies courses. This was at NYU. However, after that, I drifted into literary study. So that's mostly what I did in the intervening years, although I have taught film from time to time and I have written a little bit about film from time to time. This is my first book about a movie maker.
And you are now you're a professor at the University of Houston, but you live in New York.
Yeah, I got the job in Houston I was in my late 20s, more like mid 20s actually, right out of graduate school, and that was in the 1980s. And I lived in Houston steadily for many years, and eventually I sort of drifted up to New York, where I knew a lot of people, had some family and friends. And so I started, as writers say, I started dividing my time between these two cities.
And they let you do that.
Yeah. So I teach in spring in Houston, and the rest of the time I'm mostly in New York, and I do an online class for Houston in the fall.
This book, you could have written a book on any filmmaker. So what was it about Stanley Kubrick that made you decide this is the time I want to devote? Was there a certain anniversary coming up, or was it just like, this is one of my favorite filmmakers and I want to know more about him?
Well, to be honest, Jonathan, the idea for a book about Stanley Kubrick came from an editor rather than for me. But that's often, I'm very grateful for editors' ideas. And often an editor will know really what you want to write about before you know. And that was the case here. I hadn't thought about writing a book about Kubrick until my editor mentioned it, Eileen Smith, who edits the Yale Jewish Live series. And when she mentioned it, I realized, yeah, I really do have a deep relationship with Kubrick. And, I had seen many of his movies when they came out. I kept returning to his movies year after year. And so it seemed like the right project for me, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about his backstory. He was born in the Bronx.
Yeah, July 26, 1928.
And tell us a little bit about his childhood. He wasn't like this brilliant student.
Yeah, so during his first and second grades in school, he was absent about 60% of the time. So this is a remarkable thing. It's a phenomenon known as school refusal. Certain kids will do this. And Stanley's mother, Gert, just seems to have been very convinced of his brilliance. This was a special kid. She knew this.
Yeah.
And so she was unfazed by this. I mean, these, of course, were immigrant Jewish parents, or rather the children of immigrants. His father was a doctor. The father was very nervous about Stanley's lack of progress or lack of academic oomph. But the point was that Stanley would do the things that he was interested in. What he was interested in was chess, photography. He played drums in the jazz band for his high school, Taft High School in the Bronx. So when he was ready to immerse himself in something, he went all the way. But when he wasn't interested, he did nothing. So he graduated from high school with a 70 average.
Wow.
Which, yeah, indeed. This was the GI Bill era. And that was, so there was a lot of competition getting into college. So he failed to get into college. He didn't make it into college.
Yeah, he ends up becoming a photographer, right?
Yeah, he got a job. It was a great thing, actually, from a certain perspective, that he didn't get into college, because right out of high school, he got a job as a staff photographer on Look magazine, one of the two preeminent photography magazines in that era. Of course, there was Life and there was Look.
What kind of photographs did he take when he was at Look?
It was really a range. Look was very well known for they didn't shy away from the urban grit of America, from the underside, from poverty, divorce, trauma. So Kubrick did do a fair number of urban landscapes, and real human interest spreads. Delivery boys, circuses, various kinds of street phenomena. He did a lot of work in that region, but then he also, as well, interviewed celebrities, and he did profiles of celebrities like Montgomery Clift, Leonard Bernstein, and so on and so forth. So he was really kind of split between the human interest stories, the everyday life stories, and celebrity stories. And he did as well stories about, there was one about the Columbia campus, There was one about the University of Michigan campus. So he had a way. I find the still photography of Kubrick very entrancing. He really had a way of getting drama into these photos. And he did stage the photos, by the way. So, you'll see a couple in the subway, right, who seem to be having a, kind of high-strung but romantic moment. And, Kubrick would bring his lights into the subway, and then he would coach them. So it was a kind of preparation for movie making, for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that because his films are very thought out too. There's not a lot of spontaneity, right? Things happen over. He shoots over, as we'll get into. He shoots over and over and over and over again until he gets it right. But he was self-taught. Taught himself obviously how to be a photographer, and later would teach himself about how to be a filmmaker. There's no NYU film school in his past. He completely self-taught. How did he transition from still photography to moving pictures?
Well, this is another interesting story. He said, Kubrick was famous for sitting in the movies. First of all, he would see every movie that came out. But if he didn't like a movie, if he got bored, he'd just be sitting there reading the newspaper. He told a friend of his, well, I can do better than this. So that was his basic attitude.
Yeah, a lot of confidence. A lot of confidence this guy had.
Right. Yeah, Michael Herr, who was a later collaborator with Kubrick, he wrote the screenplay for Full Metal Jacket together with Kubrick and Gus Hasford. Michael Herr said, you'd have to be Herman Melville to transmit the full force of Stanley's will. And there was indeed that sense that when he was determined to do something, he would do it. And so it was with learning filmmaking. He read a few books about filmmaking, and he did talk to a couple of avant-garde filmmakers in the village, but for the most part it was reading books and then
going to a lot of movies. I mean, I know when he was a kid he would spend a lot of time at the Lowe's, watching movies, and then I'm sure as he got older he just watched every movie that he could get his hands on, especially from the greats. And he was very influenced, obviously, by the European filmmakers.
Yeah, in those days, and it's still true, or was true before COVID at least, the Museum of Modern Art in New York would show European films. And, Kubrick was a regular there in the late 40s.
And I get the impression from reading a book, he was sort of a beatnik before the beatniks were a thing, that he was kind of like this avant-garde, bohemian, disheveled, dressed, smoking lots of cigarettes and talking about Kafka in cafes, and just a real intellectual.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, he did. As you say, the style of dress he was unkempt. He would be wearing khakis and, an oversized jacket, uncombed hair. And he did get to know in the late 40s and early 50s some of the main characters of village intellectual life, people like Diane Arbus, another great photographer, Ouija, whose photographs were very influential, and also Dwight MacDonald and people associated with Partisan Review.
So he starts making movies, and his early movies, I wasn't as familiar with them, and I found out about them really through your book, and it's interesting because one of the reasons that I was drawn to you in this book is that my son, who is now 14, and I were doing a Stanley Kubrick film tour. Like, I've been showing him all Stanley Kubrick's movies, which has been really interesting to see it through the eyes of a 14-year-old. Not all of them are probably appropriate for 14-year-olds, although I probably saw. But anyway, as a result, we haven't done the early films, but I was interested to find out a lot of the early films were kind of more in the film noir genre.
Yes, the first two feature films are Killer's Kiss and The Killing. And The Killing, which is still, they're both wonderful films, I think. The Killing stars Sterling Hayden, who would later appear in Dr. Strangelove.
All right, sister. That's a mighty pretty head you've got on your shoulders. Do you want to keep it there, or do you want to start carrying it around in your hands?
Maybe we could compromise and put it on your shoulder. I think that'd be nice, don't you?
What were you doing outside that door?
Doing? I was listening, naturally. Trying to, I should say.
Oh, you admit it. You admit you were out there snooping.
Yes, wasn't that naughty of me? But I'm afraid I was.
And it's a very intricately plotted movie about, it's a heist film about robbing a racetrack. So one of the problems was that they couldn't get any racetrack to cooperate with them in the filming, since they didn't want this bad publicity, or they didn't want to give anyone the idea.
So I think you mentioned that they that didn't really stop them. They actually have a shot. Somebody actually, one of his cinematographers, snuck onto the racetrack and filmed anyway.
Right. Yeah, that was a great moment. And then he had to roll off just before the horses rolled over him.
So he was like right in the middle of the track filming it with like a 16 millimeter camera or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. That was at a racetrack in California. Yeah, indeed. With
That's
an
great.
IMO camera. Wonderful story. But yeah, so these are, if Kubrick had ended his career at that point, he would have been thought of as a very interesting, but certainly minor film noir director.
Right. So he transitions. I think Paths of Glory is a transitional period for him, because that's a movie that is about the First World War. It stars Kirk Douglas, who is sort of like the big actor of that time, and he an actor that he would then work with in a few films. But how did he end up getting Paths of Glory made? Because here he is kind of like critically successful, but not necessarily box office successful with his noir films, and then he's given the sort of green light to do this big war movie. How did that come about?
Yeah, that was an uphill battle, and the studios were very skeptical about the Paths of Glory project. The movie is about a botched battle in World War I, and it makes the French military look very bad indeed. They're not merely bad planners, but they also execute 3 men who become scapegoats for the military loss.
These executions will be a perfect tonic for the entire division. There are few things more fundamentally encouraging and stimulating than seeing someone else die.
I never thought of that, sir.
Well, you see, Colonel, troops are like children. Just as a child wants his father to be firm, troops crave discipline.
I see.
And one way to maintain discipline is to shoot a man now and then.
May I ask?
A movie that shows the French military at their very worst. And the movie was, in fact, banned in France between the time it was made, 1957, until the early 70s. It was banned. And when it came out, there were protests against it. It played in Berlin, and the French soldiers rolled stink bombs down the aisles at the screen. Other soldiers, too, I think. But at any rate, Paths of Glory, the studios didn't want a downbeat war film.
Yeah.
And, the rumor was that, at least at that period, that war movies were death at the box office. Red Badge of Courage, which John Huston's film, had recently not done well. But Kirk Douglas really loved the project. He wanted to do this, and he bargained with the studio, with United Artists, for the project, and he was successful.
What do you think was different about this film for Kubrick than the ones prior, aside from the subject matter?
Well, the subject matter was a big part of it.
Right.
I mean, Kubrick throughout his life was he was a not a big fan for military history. He loved reading.
Yeah.
Although he, as he said, he himself was a convinced coward, and he wasn't drafted because he got married quite early in 1948 when he was 19. So he missed Korea for that reason. But he himself was not eager to see combat, not by any means.
But he was fascinated
by it. Yeah. And later on, as you know, planned to make a movie about Napoleon, for example. So the war movie was or war stories were very important to him. And the way this is filmed, you have Kubrick's eye for detail, his perfectionism about small matters, which are really big matters, really comes through in the movie. So that when you see no man's land in Paths of Glory, Kirk Douglas is crawling across no man's land. There's a handheld camera showing him. You have explosions, and the explosions look like real bombs. They're real fragments of shell coming out, and it's not the usual kind of shower of dirt that you see in your standard Hollywood war movie. So this was something that Kubrick wanted to get right, and he did. Another remarkable thing about the movie, of course, is the way in which you have a separation between the common soldiers on the one hand, and on the other, these generals who inhabit a chateau that's been taken over by the French command. And, they, with all of their machinations and their conniving, and they're very intent on making things look good. Even if the cost is the loss of life. So, they're driving the men into an absurd battle, a useless battle, and they're all going to get killed. But, for publicity purposes, this is necessary. So you have that sense of Kubrick's suspicion of officialdom, of hierarchy, of, the guys up at top doing something for appearances. And that comes into later movies too.
that keeps coming in, that theme. So was Paths of Glory a success, like by Hollywood standards? I mean, I think critically now people look back on it and say it's a masterpiece. Mm-hmm. But back then, what was the sort of take on that film?
It was not, it didn't lose a large amount of money, but it was not a success either. And, part of the problem was the European market, which, as predicted, didn't play in France. And so the first really successful movie for Kubrick, and it was massively successful, was the next one, that is Spartacus. Yeah, so at this time, 1958, Kubrick is sort of down on his luck. He's living in LA with his wife, Christiane, whom he had married. He had met in Germany during the filming of Paths of Glory. She appears in a marvelous scene at the very end of Paths of Glory, in which she's a sort of captive German girl singing a song to the troops. So Stanley marries Christiane. They move to LA, and Stanley is making a living playing poker.
That's incredible.
This is how he's putting food on the table. Just as a few years earlier in New York, he had been making money playing chess for quarters in the park. He would spend 12 hours in Washington Square Park in New York playing chess.
And he apparently had really studied poker, and again, like, because he was interested in it, was a real student of like how to win at poker, right?
Right. Yeah, he had a poker group, of Hollywood friends, actors and directors, and he would pass out to them these cards with the probability tables on them. It's like, you have to study this to really to really be good at poker. At any rate, he gets a phone call at this time, about 1958, from Kirk Douglas, saying, the problem was that Spartacus, which is a very big deal, picture being made for Universal in Technorama, it was going to be a real sword and sandal blockbuster epic. Well, the problem was that the director, Anthony Mann, was not getting along with Kirk. And, he'd said something to Douglas. Anthony Mann had said, this was about 2 weeks, week and a half into the production. He said to Kirk Douglas, you can't play Spartacus like a Neanderthal, Kirk.
Oh, man.
And so this was not...
No, Douglas did. Kirk didn't like... Kirk had a little bit of an ego, like most Hollywood actors.
Yes.
He did not like that.
So he was out, and suddenly Kubrick was in, and, he had 24 hours notice. So he came onto the project, and... he had mixed feelings later on about Spartacus. It, was the one movie that he felt like dissociating himself from, partly because the script was not his, and he objected to the script because he saw things in it that he considered, sentimental, cheesy.
Yeah, he hates like Hollywood pathos, like cheesy endings. He apparently didn't even like the I Am Spartacus scene, which is sort of an iconic film, moment.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
That's kind of shocking, isn't it? Yeah, that Kubrick didn't want that scene, the I Am Spartacus, which is the signature of the movie.
Do we know why?
Yeah, I don't know. He thought it was corny, I think, right? And there is a kind of double character of the movie in which, well, on the one hand, Spartacus is a bold hero, and we're with him, and he's the underdog, and he's going for broke. But on the other hand, he's doomed. And, so the Spartacus is is a failure, really. And we see that at the very end of the movie where Spartacus is being crucified. He's hanging on a cross, and his slave wife holds up their baby to him, and he turns away. He says nothing, so she tells him something to the effect that,
He'll remember you, Spartacus, because I'll tell him who his father was and what he dreamed of.
Really have mercy on us. Get in the wagon.
Oh, my love, my life. Please die, Please die, my love. Oh, God,
and so, well, of course, he's been through a lot, Spartacus, that is, by this point. So, but still, this is a kind of, you have a refusal of a real Hollywood ending there, in which, stereotypically.
So I wonder if that was in the script, or if Kubrick kind of, had his last laugh at the end there, because it sounds like such a Kubrick ending.
Yeah, I suspect
ambiguous.
that he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was his relationship with Kirk Douglas? Because I think at one point you have him, Kirk Douglas is quoted as saying he was a talented shit or something like that, where it's like, I think there was a mutual respect, but they didn't necessarily like each other very much.
Yeah, there was a mutual respect, but there was quite a bit of sparring on Spartacus. Kubrick said, I told Kirk to change all these things in the script that were stupid, and he said he'd do it, but then he didn't.
Right.
So that was part of it. But at a certain point, and this I find very funny, Kirk Douglas was in psychoanalysis at the time, and so he actually brought Kubrick to meet his psychoanalyst so that Kubrick would understand Kirk Douglas better. So this was the Kirk's own sense of getting Kubrick on board. But yeah, it's not surprising that they never made another movie together, and there was actually a 5-picture contract between them, but Kirk Douglas released Kubrick from that. He knew that Kubrick and Kubrick's partner Jimmy Harris, the producer, were planning to make Lolita, and Douglas thought, "Oh, this is useless. This movie will never get made. It's impossible."
I want to just linger on this idea of him and his relationship with his actors, because I often find directors are either, really good at working with actors, or they're more like craftsmen, and that sometimes they're not both. And I get the sense that Kubrick actually was, I don't know if you could say he was an actor's director, because he was definitely had an antagonistic relationship sometimes with the actors, but he seemed to understand actors and how to get the best performance out of them. I think you were saying in Spartacus, one of the characters, he plays like a piece of classical music for him to sort of get into the rhythm of how that character would walk and talk, right? Like he understood the process of acting.
Yeah, he did something which was done in the silent era. That is, he played music for some of the actors. For example, Prokofiev for Woody Strode, who plays the Ethiopian gladiator named Draba. So to get him in the mood, it was like, I have just the right piece of music for you, he said to the actor. So there's that. And, I think most actors really did like working with Kubrick. He has the reputation of being, someone who would just ask for another take, another take, another take, even if, you were getting to 100 takes or sometimes even 200 takes. And he wouldn't really guide the actor very specifically. And somebody said, this was Murray Melvin, who played in Barry Lyndon, he said, Stanley knew that if you told an actor that was good, that you would put it in quotation marks and kill it. So, if you tell an actor, yeah, I like that bit, or do that bit again, then, they're going to screw it up somehow. At least this was Kubrick's theory.
Yeah.
So he would simply say, let's just go again.
Yeah, you say like that's a very common refrain on it. Let's do it again. That's like the most common refrain on a Kubrick set. Do it again.
And sometimes he would choose one of the early takes. So he just wanted to have a lot of takes recorded.
And that was maddening. Like he would do like 70 takes, right? I mean, that was
right. Although there was somebody who was worse in film history, and that was Chaplin.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so Chaplin actually recorded in his early movie, The Circus. Chaplin recorded 700 takes of a particular scene. And it wasn't the tightrope scene in which he's trying to learn how to. I mean, it's also because Chaplin is trying to figure out how to do this without breaking his neck. But nevertheless, 700 is a lot. So yeah, Chaplin would routinely get up into those 3-digit numbers fairly routinely as well. But for Kubrick, well, one actor, I think it was Matthew Modine, said, something happens around take 28 or 29. And this was part of it too. Kubrick thought actors don't really know their lines. You can see them trying to remember their lines. But then at a certain point, it all becomes much more inward, and they're not trying to remember anymore. So after you get past a certain number of takes, he thought, the actors have really internalized things, and it becomes more interesting.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'm going to skip ahead a few movies. I mean, it's all in your book, so I very highly recommend your book. Dr. Strangelove and Lolita's in there. But I do want to talk about 2001 because it is really considered to be Kubrick's great masterpiece. And it's so interesting to hear the story of that film, and the fact that Arthur Clarke, at that time that he met, Arthur Clarke was kind of like this penniless, struggling writer, and they found this story that he had written, right, and they decided to adapt it into a movie. And, you think of like Arthur Clarke as being this, science fiction, powerhouse. But at the time, he was not very well known. So Kubrick kind of almost in a way discovered him. So talk to me a little bit about the genesis of that movie and why he decided to jump into that world.
Yeah, it's an interesting setting. And I, of course, write about this. So does Michael Benson in a very interesting book about 2001. About the making of the movie. In the early 60s, Kubrick and Christiane, his wife, were in New York City, and they had an interesting social set around them. Artie Shaw, the jazz musician who had turned to movie making, and they loved shotguns, both Artie Shaw and Kubrick, so they bonded over their love of firing off weapons. Terry Southern, the kind of scathing comic writer, who had worked on Dr. Strangelove. And Kubrick was trying to figure out what to do next. And they ran across a book by Arthur Kubrick, Childhood's End, and they just thought it was terrific. I mean, here was science fiction, but very sophisticated, very thought out. And Arthur C. Clarke, they thought, had, he could describe worlds and alien environments in a way as if it's as if he were describing people or emotions. He had such a touch for that. So of course, the studios thought of science fiction movies as cheap, cheaply made. They don't make much money, and they look cheap, stupid, and vulgar.
Yeah.
And that was more or less true. 2001 would be a movie that looked like no other previous science fiction movie. It still looks great.
Yeah, it still looks incredible, and it's filmed in the 60s. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there are all these process shots, over 200 process shots. So, first you lay down the outer space environment with the stars, you put in the spaceship, so you have to layer one thing over another. There's a model of the spaceship. You have the stars and the darkness of space. And all of this works spectacularly well, I think, in the movie. But the interesting thing about the movie, the really revolutionary thing about it, I think, is that it was the first Hollywood movie that really makes you work to find meaning.
Yeah.
To speculate. And in that sense, it's kind of the triumph of the art house movie. Art house movies would make you do this. You'd wonder, like, what the heck does that mean? That ending. But this was the first big-time Hollywood movie that did that.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that movie would even be made today with that kind of a budget, because it's not really a popcorn movie at all, even though audiences love it. But at that time, it seemed to also just be a movie of its time too, because it was a huge hit. I mean, you mentioned that it was out actually for 4 years after its first release in theaters. It was like, I think you said that John Lennon said he saw the movie every week, which is amazing.
Everybody was seeing it over and over, and almost invariably, of course, under the influence of some substance.
Yeah.
That was part of the, the aura of the movie. But yeah, it's funny because MGM, they were convinced that they had a mammoth turkey on their hands, a true disaster. And so many executives walked out of the first screening. And it was just, it was a massive exodus. So, Kubrick and Christiane went away to a hotel room that night in Long Island. And she said, he couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't sleep and he couldn't speak. But then by the next afternoon, when the picture had opened in theaters, there were reports that people were lining up to see it. And they were all under 30 years of age. So
he must have been blown away by that.
Yes. So that was that was a triumph. And then, of course, it wound up being one of MGM's 10 biggest moneymakers of all time. As you say, it stayed in release for a long time, and it kept getting re-released in the 1970s.
It's so interesting. So the movie's called 2001. Obviously, it was filmed in the 60s, and it was kind of predicting in some ways what 2001 would look like. And it turns out 2001, in some ways, was like, but also like, it's so funny to, sometimes I'll go to like Future World or whatever at Disneyland, and like what Walt Disney and people from the past thought the future would look like. And it was always spaceships. It was always like, there're going to be a lot of spaceships. And that actually didn't come to true. But what Kubrick got right was this whole idea of AI. He was definitely ahead of that, and sort of the man versus AI.
It's interesting. I mean, he died, of course, in 1999. So unfortunately, if he'd lasted, and he died, much too early at age 70, if he'd lasted a couple more years, that would have been interesting for people, interviewers surely would have asked him. He did predict, the thing about AI, first of all, this is very interesting, because Hal in 2001 has exactly this combination of the solicitous and the sinister that I think, we associate now with AI, at least in certain aspects, so that there is something creepy about it, but there's this kind of solicitous and somewhat patronizing aspect to it as well. This is what we hear from our robotic guides. Whether
you were saying Alexa, Siri. Somebody that you can. I didn't realize that you can make Alexa into Hal's voice from 2001.
Oh, yes.
That's amazing.
Right. Yes.
What are you doing, David?
I haven't tried that. Oh, you do that well. Yeah. I'm getting the creeps now. But yeah, the great, the Canadian actor Douglas Rain, who Kubrick said he liked it because the voice has that sort of patronizing asexual quality, which is which is right on target. It
doesn't judge you. It judges you, but it's subtle.
Right.
Well, I want to have you explain that ending to me, because I tried. My son and I, who saw it recently, tried to discuss what it meant, and it's up to interpretation. The ending of that movie. Who is the star child, and what does that signify? And I mean, people will be debating that for the rest of time. I want to jump ahead to The Shining. Because selfishly, because it's a movie that I saw fairly recently with my son, so it's very fresh in my mind, and I hadn't seen it in 25 years, so it was pretty interesting to return to it, because I had seen it so many times when I was a kid. I think that was one of those movies that was like on cable TV, early in cable TV's genesis, and I remember just seeing it over and over and over again, and when I was a kid, so it had a huge impact on me. But you say that it's his most personal film, and I'm interested what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, I would say, in a sense, Eyes Wide Shut, too, is his most first. But those two, both those movies are about marriage. Actually, Barry Lyndon is also about marriage. We don't normally think of Kubrick as a filmmaker focused on marriage, but those three
was he married for? How many times was he married?
He was married 3 times.
Okay.
So the last one that I mentioned here, to Christiane Harlan, then Christiane Kubrick, that lasted for 40 years. And it was, by all accounts, a very happy marriage. And, you could see why. I interviewed her, and she is just, she's so witty, she's so warm. You could really see, you could really see the companionable aspect.
He couldn't have been easy to be married to, that's for sure.
No, he wasn't easy, although he was very devoted to family. And, you know, he always wanted the daughters to be around him. They had this enormous estate, big house in Chidwickbury, England, near London. And he had to have everybody close by. He was somewhat controlling with the daughters, of course. But in any event, so he was married first to... Yes, you can say that again. So the first marriage was to his high school sweetheart, Toba, in 1948 when he was 19. That lasted a couple of years. But they were more like buddies, really, somebody said, rather than this being a real love relationship. The second one was very tumultuous, and that was to a ballet dancer and art designer named Ruth Sabatka in the mid-50s. So recently in the archives, what has popped up in the Kubrick archives are some script treatments that he wrote in the 1950s about a disastrous marriage. And these things are, you know, it's quite Dostoevskian, you know, scenes of jealousy and hysteria and rage. And so when you think of The Shining, I think Kubrick had to be thinking back to this second marriage of his, which lasted just a few years, but which really made its mark on him. And Ruth, you know, she was a very substantial intellectual presence in her own right, and you know, really further along in her career than Stanley was in his. But she seems to have been simultaneously both rather clingy and also, you know, difficult to deal with in other ways, as he was himself. So when we get to The Shining, of course, some of the scenes are also inflected by Jack Nicholson's own memory of a relationship. And he himself said, Nicholson himself said that, you know, the scene in which Wendy interrupts his work, that was what ended my relationship. You know?
Right.
Exactly that happened.
What do you want me to do about it?
Come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later on with a couple of sandwiches for you, and maybe you'll let me read something then.
Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah?
Fine. And we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing. Whether you don't hear me typing, whether the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. Now, do you think you can handle that?
Yeah.
Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Oh my God, he is so creepy in that movie. Yeah, it's definitely personal for Nicholson because he goes to a place that's very dark. But as far as being personal, so he's happily married, but it's him exploring the sort of masculine rage, I guess, that he feels all the time.
Yeah, Diane Johnson, who wrote the screenplay with him, the novelist Diane Johnson, she said, it was amazing how well Stanley could write these, you know, scenes of maniacal rage. And it's like, he's so mild-mannered, you know, where was this coming from? So, you know, clearly it was coming from somewhere.
Yeah, and he wasn't, there were some interesting things that you bring up, though, in the book. One is that he wasn't particularly nice to Shelley Duvall. He kind of tortured her throughout the movie, and maybe that was by design because he wanted her to sort of be, you know, her character in that movie is so on edge and nervous, and maybe he was trying to shake her up a bit.
Yeah, he was, and she knew that. And he also put the crew on notice. Don't be too nice to Shelley, he said. So, you know, this was a deliberate plan. But she did say at the end of the filming that she had learned more from Kubrick about acting than she had from Robert Altman, in whose films she had starred before. So, you know, so she really, it wasn't easy for her. that movie, but she acknowledged that she had really developed as an actor as a result of Kubrick's direction.
And the little boy,
Danny Lloyd, yeah.
Yeah, he didn't even know he was in a horror movie. Like,
right, this is remarkable
kind
too.
Of amazing. He thought he would. Yeah. It's like the Truman Show. Like, he doesn't even realize. He thinks this is like some cute like Mickey Mouse movie, and he's like in the scariest movie ever made.
Right. Yeah.
So how did they shield him from that?
Well, so he didn't see the buckets of blood that were, when they were filming it, the village downstream was convinced that there was a massacre because all these buckets of blood kept, being emptied out. Because Kubrick was like, no, the blood's not the right color. We have to do this again.
See, that's amazing that it was real, right? Because now that would have been all CGI, but that was real blood. I mean, not blood, but it was real liquid.
It was real liquid. Yeah. So, it's... CGI is an important factor in Kubrick's career too, as you know, because he planned to make AI and he handed it over to Spielberg in the end because, CGI was not yet at the point where they were not ready for that yet. And Kubrick didn't use it himself, had never used it. But at any rate, Danny Lloyd didn't know that it was a horror movie. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And it also had a different ending, which is now lost. Like nobody can find it. It was one of those movies where they filmed a few different endings. I mean, the way it ends now seems perfect, but there was an ending. What was it? There was an ending where she's in the hospital, like at the end. What's that?
She's in the hospital, and the fellow who is the hotel manager comes to visit her, and Danny is there too, the little boy. And so he rolls a tennis ball towards Danny. This is the same tennis ball that we saw rolling down the hall in the movie itself. So the idea is that Wendy is recuperating in the hospital, from this trauma of the husband who almost killed her, and then we have a kind of budding camaraderie, but a very creepy kind of camaraderie between the hotel manager, Ullman, and the little boy. So this was supposed to come, it did, in previews, come right after the actual ending that we now see with the photograph of Jack on the wall, from 1921.
Yeah.
So, and that is such a perfect ending. Yeah, it makes you think.
Like what? Yeah,
why would we need this coda? Why is it there? So several people told Kubrick that this wasn't working, I think, including Julian Sr., who was a producer, friend of his. And I think he was quickly convinced that, we got to cut this.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he wouldn't be the easiest person to tell things aren't working, because you have, moments when he's telling people, don't tell me how to make a movie. Like he definitely would shoot back at people when they tried to. He would get very Jack, Shining-ish, if you got a little too close to his process, creative
that
process.
That was the case, but also, it's important to remember, though, that, for example, in Full Metal Jacket, he would routinely go over script possibilities with Vincent D'Onofrio, who played who played Private Pyle, and Matthew Modine, who played Joker. They would be in the trailer, and Kubrick was saying, how should we end this thing? And there were certainly cases where he looked to the actors on 2001 as well to supply ideas and followed them.
Yeah, it was interesting when you said that D'Onofrio on Full Metal Jacket, that he was really just like a bouncer or something at that time, or he was like he wasn't a real actor at that time, or not a successful working actor. And that's like one of the great performances, especially the scene where, right before he kills him, not spoiler alert, before he kills the drill sergeant and himself, where he makes that face, where he's just like, where he has his full malfunction.
Right.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about Kubrick as an artist and as a person, because, I think sometimes when you're, other creative people who are listening to this, what was it about Kubrick that made him so brilliant? And, what can I learn from him, in my own kind of creative endeavors, aside from just, looking at his work? And, he, like a lot of great artists, he was a very complicated person, obviously. And the impression I get from reading your book is that he was definitely not the easiest person to be around or to work with. he was obviously completely a perfectionist. We talked about this a little bit, where he would film things over and over again. And he also, you mentioned even in Barry Lyndon, like it had to be like they filmed scenes in candlelight, right? So like, which was very complicated and difficult and made everybody very anxious. I mean, is your sense like he was kind of a perfectionist? He was we talked about he was a control freak. I'm talking about all the negative things here. Very, very detail oriented. There was no detail that was too mundane. He would be like, but at the same time, well, aside from making amazing movies, he also seemed to be very personable. Like he would talk to people for hours and hours and hours on the phone. So do you feel like you would have gotten along with him? Like, what's your take on what he was like?
That's an interesting question. And, people I've known who have interviewed him or tried to interview him have told me that Kubrick was just very nervous, with journalists, critics, people of that sort. So he didn't like being interviewed, especially. And so that inflected things. But with actors, during the making of a movie or with other people, he was frequently very expansive and very chummy and very, of course, he had very wide-ranging intellectual interests and could talk about a lot of things. One of the key aspects of this, I think, is that control freak, yes, but there are different kinds of control freaks. On the one hand, you have a director like Hitchcock who, famously said, well, the filming is the boring part. Hitchcock would have every shot planned out. Everything would be storyboarded. And then, well, you just go and make the movie, ... Kubrick was the opposite of that. He refused to have a shot list. He wanted things to be more free form. He wanted to be able to change his mind. He was someone who really thrived on probably the most difficult part of a director's job, which is just, as Jimmy Harris, his filmmaking partner, put it, you come in the morning and there's 100 people who need an answer from you, It's like, what about this? What about this?
Yeah,
what
you have
about
to be
this
decisive,
other thing?
yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be decisive. You have to be cool. Don't rush to judgment. Don't make mistakes. Be patient. Kubrick's big line was, he once said, well, making a movie is kind of like writing War and Peace in a bumper car. And so, it's like, here is your great work. And yet, there are all these things constantly interfering.
You're not just alone in a room with a light. And yet he obviously loved it.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think we can learn as artists from Kubrick?
Yeah, I think one thing really is taking the time. And of course, people will say, oh, he was in a very privileged position. And of course, he was later in his career. Warner Brothers knew that he made his movies for relatively little money because his crews were small. And, however the movie did, the movies were making money. Even Barry Lyndon made money in the global market. So they would let him take his time. They wouldn't rush him. There were 7 years between The Shining and Full Metal Jacket. There were 11 years between Full Metal Jacket and Eyes Wide Shut.
Wow.
And in the course of that time, Kubrick would be constantly reading, turning over this project, that project, working on this script, that script. So he really was able to take his time and refuse to be rushed. So that's a very important thing. Another thing is to find the right collaborators, and this he did very effectively, both with screenwriters and with his art directors, like the great Ken Adam, who worked on Dr. Strangelove, who designed the War Room in Dr. Strangelove. So he really, he assembled his partners, and he took his time.
This is probably like asking you who your favorite child is, but do you have a favorite Kubrick movie?
Oh, yeah, that is such a hard question. I think for a long time it was 2001. I think I may be shifting over towards The Shining now.
Interesting.
And it's the movie that I like to teach the most, I think. I like to teach The Shining, and I like to teach Full Metal Jacket. And I find that students in particularly write very well and think very well about the ending of Full Metal Jacket. But also The Shining. There are mysteries in the movie, and there are lots of corners to look in.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned those two, and I'm not saying this just because you're in my interview, but those are probably the two that I'm the most familiar with, and I think it's probably because those were the ones that were on the most, again, on television the most when I was growing up. So, I mean, I must have seen Full Metal Jacket, again, is another movie I hadn't seen in a long time, but I showed it to my son recently, and I was like, wow, I can almost recite lines from this movie. I've seen it so many times. I hadn't realized how many times I had seen it. And that, we haven't talked a lot about that in this interview, but that I feel like is sometimes forgotten in his canon of amazing movies, probably one of the great Vietnam War movies ever made. And
I agree.
And what is it that you think resonates so much with your students about the end of that movie?
Well, you know, what happens, spoiler alert again, we have Joker killing, it's a sort of mercy killing the teenage sniper, the woman sniper who has been shooting his squad. And everything is in Joker's face. I mean, you just look at him, you know, you wonder what's going through his head. You think about how the others are reacting. And then you move into a scene where, you know, they're marching across this, seems like a hellish landscape. You know, there are fires burning. And Joker, Matthew Modine as Joker is saying, you know, that he's now happy.
I am so happy that I am alive, in one piece, and short.
And short, he is short, which means he'll be going home soon.
Yes, but I am alive, and I am not afraid.
So, you know, you just wonder, is this ironic? Is this, you know, this is dark.
Yeah, they lost their souls. Yeah, what's happened? And they're singing the Mickey Mouse theme.
And they're singing the Mickey Mouse theme, right? They had been, Kubrick said, I realized only a few years earlier, you know, these young men would have been boys sitting in front of their TV sets, you know, and they were singing the Mickey Mouse theme song. So it's, you know, it's a chilling ending and an ambiguous ending. You know, the movie, when I first saw the movie, and I saw it when it came out, I had the reaction that a lot of people did, which is I loved that first half an hour, or like 20 minutes in boot camp, but then the rest seems sort of wandering and disconnected. But then you realize later on that it's wandering and disconnected because that's what the experience is. You know, that is terrifying.
And you also break it down in your book, I think, right? Is it like it's like the opening sequence in boot camp is 20 minutes, and then like the scene with the sniper killing everybody, not everybody, but killing a lot of the soldiers is also 20 minutes. Like he actually, it does flow. If you really dissect the movie, it feels like it's wandering, but it's really actually very tight. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, I didn't know. There's so many things to learn about his movies in your book. So thank you for writing it and giving us a real full picture of not only the movie, but also the man. It was really interesting read. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Jonathan. This was so much fun talking.
Yeah, it's so much fun talking to you. Well, have a great rest of your day. And
great. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Okay, have a good one.
I really did enjoy it.
Me too. Take care, David. Right About Now is a production of Strike Fire Productions. If you really enjoyed this podcast, you can support it every month by heading over to our Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/rightaboutnowpodcast. For as little as $5 a month, you can make this whole thing possible and even receive bonus podcasts delivered right to your email. So until we meet again, this is Jonathan Small, encouraging you to do the right thing.